Hi, I'm Mike O'Brien. I'm the author of the Tougaloo Nine, the Jackson Library sit-in at the crossroads of Civil War and Civil Rights. And that title will become more clear as we go along. I am a longtime resident of Northern Virginia, came here in 1960 with my family, lived in Arlington in my growing up years, then Fairfax in my adult years, raised a family, and found a great job with an organization, a not-for-profit cooperative, and I worked as their public relations and communications director for 30-plus years, all the while honing my writing skills so I would have the ability to write such a wonderful book. In fact, I was writing a book, my first book during the time I was working, and that book came out in 2013, and it was called We Shall Not Be Moved. It was the story of the Jackson-Woolworth sit-in in 1963. And I came upon that story thanks to someone I met while in Arlington who had been part of the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement was something that I was always drawn to, and thought if I ever had a chance to write anything, it would be about that. So there was a perfect opportunity. This was a sit-in, one of the most violent sit-ins in the civil rights era, where a lot of young kids gathered and started dumping ketchup and mustard and yelling horrible things at the demonstrators. And there's a famous iconic picture that captures it all. So I was able to write that book. It came out on the anniversary, the 50th anniversary of that sit-in in 2013, and it got a lot of attention because of that. As a result, I was invited to Jackson, and during that day, the actual day of that sit-in's anniversary, I met one of the Tougaloo Nine. And that basically introduced me to my next project when I had just finished my first. I met a guy by the name of James Sammy Bradford, who was one of the Tougaloo Nine. He was at a reception that evening. And he was a guy who had lived in Mississippi for most of his adult life and was always called upon to represent the Tougaloo Nine at various civil rights events. By the time I came upon him, he was really frustrated that nobody was writing about the Tougaloo Nine. And he was hearing everybody else talked about but the Tougaloo Nine. So when we first met, he knew I was the writer of this book, and he grabbed my hand, he introduced himself and said, "Mike, I know why this sit-in, the Woolworth sit-in, gets all the attention, because it was so dramatic." And then he leaned in and pulled me closer and said, "But ours was the first." And with that invitation, it took me a while to realize that was an invitation, but eventually the Tougaloo Nine book became a passion of mine. And so for the next dozen years, I worked on finding everything about that I could, including interviewing all of the surviving members of the Tougaloo Nine, doing deep research and newspapers and anything that I could find that would reveal why that sit-in was so important. And what we're going to hear today is kind of the heart of the book, the 3 days in late March of 1961, 2 years before the Woolworth sit-in, when the first students decided to stand up and take a stand for freedom. And there had never been a sit-in in Jackson, or even in the whole state of Mississippi, until this sit-in that the Tougaloo Nine did at the library. And that's why this is an important moment in Mississippi movement history. The original sit-ins began in 1960, February of 1960 in North Carolina. And all throughout the South, after that, there had been an explosion of sit-ins in just about every city and certainly every state except for Mississippi. And the reason was that Mississippi was just too locked down. It was too dangerous for people even to attempt such a thing. And it was at Tougaloo College, this private, historically black college just outside of Jackson, that a group of students began to gather and say, "Hey, there's stuff going on all over the place. Why aren't we doing anything?" And that's where the idea came from, to do some kind of sit-in. Why a library sit-in? Because it was quiet there, because it was a place where people go to study, which made sense for students. And also, they felt that they would be safer there. The crowds wouldn't gather, they wouldn't get insults hurled at them, or worse, be attacked. So that's how the library idea came about. I want to say just a word about each of the students. We know them as the Tougaloo Nine, but they were each individuals, and I got to meet every one of them, so I want to just introduce you to them as well. I have one big story of the first one, Joseph Jackson Jr., who was the president of the Tougaloo College chapter of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, which had just been formed at Tougaloo, that branch, a year before. And that was really the catalyst for this change as well. The Tougaloo College chapter had been talking up for over a year what would be a good way of getting some kind of activist movement going. And Joe Jackson had an interesting background. Joe, the way I set the book up is in 3 sections for the 9 students in 3 geographic locations. So Joe was from Memphis, and 3 of the students were from Memphis. Joe Jackson had family in Mississippi, in the Delta, Belzoni, Mississippi. He and his mother, when he was 11 years old, were in Belzoni visiting grandparents and were on their way back. The bus, Greyhound bus, stopped in Clarksdale, Mississippi, the home of the blues. They got off for a pit stop on their way back. Joe's mother was a little bit in front of him, but they were heading back to the bus. She stops and just has a word with the bus driver. And Joe doesn't know exactly what happens, except that within seconds, the bus driver is lifting his hand, smacking his mother across the face, and knocking her to the ground. Imagine, 11-year-old mother is everything to him. He runs up to her, tries to help her back onto the bus before the bus driver jumps into the bus and takes off. Joe never talked to his mother about what exactly she said, but that was the kind of situation that could occur in Mississippi if a black person in any way stepped out of line or said something that might not have been quite appropriate, or even addressed a white person if they didn't want to be addressed. And he learned very quickly, this system is not right, it's not safe, and when he grew up, if he could do anything about it, he was going to take that chance. So he became the head of the NAACP at Tougaloo College, and gathered around him a lot of other people who felt the same way. And these other 9 are, the 3 were from Memphis, so the other ones from Memphis were Ethel Sawyer, a smart, intelligent woman who loved Memphis and didn't really feel the sting of segregation because she was in an entirely black enclave of North Memphis. And I talked to you about Sammy Bradford, who got me into this project. He was also from North Memphis. So those 3 were what I call the Memphis contingent. Then we have 3 who were from the Delta, the historically black farm cotton region, where the black people did all the work and harvested the cotton. We have Janice Jackson, no relation to Joe, best friend of Ethel. They met on the way to Tougaloo College on the bus on their first day at Tougaloo. We also have Al Lassiter from Vicksburg, the city of Vicksburg, that Civil War bastion, high on the hill above the Mississippi River. And we also have Geraldine Edwards, who loved to read, and her favorite place was in a library. So it makes perfect sense that she would end up in a library for her first demonstration. And then finally we have the Central and South Mississippi group, made up of Al Cook from Edwards, Mississippi, just about 30 miles from Jackson, between Vicksburg and Jackson. And we also have Meredith Anding, who was actually the only native Jacksonian in the group, and he had a long history in his family of activism that he was able to learn from. So he was a perfect person to be in the library that day as well. So, and the last member of the Tougaloo Nine that we'll talk about is Evelyn Pierce. Evelyn was from Laurel, Mississippi, a Klan stronghold, but also a place that produced Leontine Price, the great opera singer. Evelyn's family was familiar with Leontine and her family because Leontine's mother was a doula, and she had birthed all of the Pierce family. So they were very close. It was a very close enclave in Laurel of the Black community. So now we're going to just jump into the heart of the story, which is the sit-in itself and the aftermath. And like I said, there are 3 days. The day of the sit-in is day number 1. Day 2, believe it or not, the very next day was the centenary celebration in Mississippi of the state's secession from the Union and its joining of the Confederacy. And many people don't know this, but the history of the Civil Rights Movement overlaps by 100 years the history of the Civil War. And that's how the title, the book's title, got its name. The Mississippi had a blowout celebration on day 2, and we'll talk about that. And then day 3 was the day of the trial. And now, you know, today many trials don't happen that quickly right after an incident, but the powers that be wanted to make sure that other Black Mississippians learn that there would be swift justice for anybody who stepped out of line. So the court made a special arrangement at the end of the day on that day 3 to have these students come to trial. And we'll talk about what happened there. That's where the real fireworks start. So day 1, simple planning had gone on for months for how this would all be carried out, and it went flawlessly. The students were delivered down to the library at about 11 a.m. They first stopped at the Black Library, George Washington Carver Library, where they went in, looked for some books that they knew wouldn't be there because the selection was much less than what you would get at the White Library. So they went in, asked the librarian for these very esoteric books that they had picked out. Of course, they weren't there. And the librarian tried to describe how they could see if the books were available at the White Library. She could send over for them and have them brought back to the Carver Library. And the students smiled and said, "No, that's okay. We'll just go over there and find out ourselves." That was totally something that wouldn't have been done in Mississippi. And Meredith Anding, who was a Jacksonian, knew the librarian, so he just winked at her, and she knew exactly what was going on. And they left the library to go down to the State Street Library, which was the grand, beautiful, newly constructed white library. They walk in. For some of them, it was a surreal experience. They knew this was challenging all the stereotypes that they had grown up with by entering that library. And they just went in, talked to the librarian. She told them the same thing they had heard at Carver. They said, "Well, we would just like to look around." And so they started looking around, and she called the police. The police arrived in about 10 minutes and told the students if they were to leave immediately, they would not be arrested, and they could go about their business. Of course, the students stayed. They wanted this to become a case that the NAACP could use to bring through the legal system. So they didn't move until the police said, "All right, you're under arrest." And at that moment, they immediately stood up and started walking towards the door under police escort. There's a very famous picture of where, and it's the only one where all the 9 are present as they leave the library. They are escorted to the police cars and whisked away to the police station, which is only a couple blocks away. They're fingerprinted, they get their photos taken, which is where we get these wonderful portraits of them on that very day, and then are locked in cells, the women in one cell and the men in another. The one thing that, once they got to the police station, things went awry. They expected immediately to be bailed out. The NAACP had pulled together some bail money, and the lawyers were all ready to bail them out. They went to the courthouse to do that, and the sheriff, the white sheriff, had decided this was beyond the beyond, that black students would enter a white space. And so he told his administrative staff not to take the bail money and that he was going to leave town so that he could not be found to give the order to accept the bail. So he left town, and the students were required, therefore, to stay in jail overnight, which was a shock to them. And the more and more the hours went by and they realized they weren't going to get bailed out, the higher the tension ratcheted for them, because they had no idea what would happen to them during the night. So day 2, March 28th, 1961. This is the day when Mississippi is celebrating the 100th anniversary of its secession from the Union. And most people don't think about it, but the Civil Rights Movement and the Civil War were exactly 100 years apart. The Civil War, 1861 to 1865, Civil Rights Movement, at least the student-led movement part, 1960 to 1965. So there's a total overlap, and while the Civil Rights Movement is going on in America, there's this whole other world that is celebrating or commemorating what happened 100 years earlier. And in Mississippi, what that meant was a Confederate celebration, an all-out blowout for Confederate culture. So a whole day of activities was planned in downtown Jackson. A parade, which would go on for several hours in the morning, a pageant in the afternoon outside the old state capitol building where the Articles of Secession were actually taken, a tea in the afternoon at the governor's mansion down the street, and then 4 Confederate balls that evening with everyone dressed up in Confederate gowns and regalia. So while the students are in jail, this celebration of Confederate culture, 35,000 people attended the parade on Capitol Street, which is the main business street of Jackson. 5,000 people marched up Capitol Street, 3,000 of them dressed up as Confederate soldiers with fake guns and forage hats, the whole thing. There were drum majorettes and marching bands. 38 high schools and college bands came to Jackson, playing Dixie all day long up that street. So while the students are festering in jail, wondering when they're going to get out, we have this clash of cultures, the heritage culture commemorating the past with the multicultural America sitting up in jail, pushing for a new day, a new approach to how we're going to live. And what happens is during the break between the governor's tea and the Confederate balls that evening, the police finally allow the students to get out of jail. And they are whisked back to campus in police cars, sirens blaring, and they arrive on campus and are welcomed by the hundreds of students at Tougaloo to great applause and excitement because finally somebody has started to stand up against this crazy segregationist system. Day 3 is the trial, and the students just went through their regular routine in the morning, and in the afternoon at 4 o'clock they were brought down to the courthouse, which is also downtown, just a few blocks from where all the activity had been the day before. And a group had gathered, about 100 black people and about 100 white people were interested in this trial. And the courtroom filled up very quickly, and so many people were left out on the street. The police divided them, of course, by race, even outdoors. And when the students arrived at the courthouse, the black citizens who were there to support them gave up a big cheer as they exited their cars and walked up the stairs to the courthouse. And this set off the police. The police were out in force, And they went chasing after the black citizens and started beating them with their billy clubs. They had borrowed a few police dogs from Vicksburg. They didn't even have their own in Jackson yet. And they allowed those dogs to start biting and chasing the people who were bystanders, just to show them that such behavior, such obvious support for black students who had broken the law was inappropriate. Medgar Evers, who was the head of the NAACP in Jackson, was part of that crowd and got beaten on the head, and all mayhem broke out. The FBI would later get involved. And inside the courtroom, the students weren't exposed to any of that. Inside the courtroom is where the real action was. And the question was what was going to happen to these students who had broken the local segregation laws. They were just fined, because it was the first time I think the police and the justice system went easy on them. They were fined $100 each and given 30 days jail time, but that time was suspended if they would return to school and not participate in any additional demonstrations, which the students happily did. The NAACP paid their fine, and they abided by the terms of their parole, and actually never, ever had to see the inside of a courtroom or a jail again for the rest of their lives. What happens after the Nine return back to Tougaloo after their trial is that their effort has really inspired other youth of Jackson to begin taking a stand. So in the wake of the Tougaloo Nine library sit-in, there's a bus sit-in. There's a sit-in at the city zoo where black people are not allowed to sit on the benches. Some young people begin sitting on the benches and getting arrested. There's a challenge at the swimming pool where only whites are supposed to swim. So a number of black students try to get into the swimming pool and they're arrested. So a number of things begin to happen to show that from now on, things are going to be different around here, and we're not going to be putting up with this segregation stuff. And then what happens next is that help from the outside begins to arrive in the form of the Freedom Rides. And the Freedom Rides then become the big story. This is the buses that have come in from all over the South, bringing whites and blacks in, you know, integrating the various spaces and getting arrested. So the civil rights movement then really begins in force when that happens, and Mississippi is never really the same again. The legacy of the Tougaloo Nine, however, can be grasped, I think, in one frame in miniature. It's interesting to know that several years after the Tougaloo Nine sit-in, a young man by the name of Benny Thompson enters Tougaloo College in 1964. And Benny went through 4 years at Tougaloo, graduated in 1968, and almost immediately went into public service, first at his hometown of Bolton, moving through the ranks on the city council, becoming mayor, becoming a county council member of Hinds County, eventually getting elected to the U.S. Congress in 1993 and serving there for 33 years and counting. And as many of you know, was the head of the January 6th Commission that oversaw the indictments of several people who had participated in that insurrection, where the Confederacy was in full flower once again. So Benny Thompson knew some of the Tougaloo Nine, went to school with some of them, and was inspired by their action. In his congressional office for all these years has been a painting of the Tougaloo Nine in the highest point of the office and point of pride. And he told me specifically that he thinks of them every day. He thinks of their courage and their decision that they took, their dangerous decision to step out and try to make a change. And that's what he does every day of his professional life as a result of the example of the Tougaloo Nine. So that example has now pushed them forward into the future. And thanks to Sammy Bradford now, we have a book that captures their whole story. So we talked about the legacy of the Tougaloo Nine. I want to end with just this quote from Myrlie Evers, the wife of Medgar Evers. Of course, in 1963, after the Jackson-Woolworth sit-in, 2 weeks later, Medgar Evers is assassinated because of the uprising that's occurring in Jackson. He is seen as the leader. His wife goes on and becomes a civil rights leader in her own right, but in the meantime writes this memoir of her life with Medgar. And she was one of the eyewitnesses of everything that happened in Jackson during that crucial period of the civil rights movement. And here's what she has to say, and it's about the Tougaloo Nine. The change of tide in Mississippi did not begin until 1961. Then, almost imperceptibly, Negroes took the offensive in the struggle for full citizenship. It began on March 27th, when 9 Negro students from Tougaloo Southern Christian College, all members of NAACP youth groups, entered Jackson's white public library, sat down, and began to read. It's fascinating that she claims and puts in primary place the Tougaloo Library sit-in as the beginning of change in Mississippi. That is really the legacy of the Tougaloo Nine. They started things off, and we are here to carry things forward. Thank you.